Hello and welcome to The Future Farmer in association with Cars Billington, leading the industry through people, products and innovation. I'm Nick Wallis, and on each episode I'll be exploring an agricultural topic and discovering the technology that can help bring sustainable and profitable solutions to farming. From the science behind good silage to the efficient management of your milking systems. And here's a taster of what's to come. In this episode...
Yeah, it's a nicer way for cows, so they can choose when they want to be milked. So they also get fed at the same time, so that's the other motivator for going into the robot. But a nicer, higher welfare way of milking cows really can be.
Today we'll be looking at how to improve our robotic milking systems and focusing on what can be done to better paw visits. And I can assure you there are probably more factors than you'd think. Guiding us through on the Future Farmer podcast is Technical Manager Dr. Ruth Lawson.
Hello, I'm Ruth Lawson. I'm Technical Manager at Cars Billington. I formulate rations for dairy cows, particularly interested in robotic milking and high-performing herds.
Ruth, first of all, just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into this job and what your interest is in dairy farming.
Yeah, sure. So I was brought up on a farm. And I studied at Newcastle University, studied agriculture, and then went on to a PhD at Leeds. Worked in dairy research and teaching, and got into formulating diets for milk cows, which I particularly enjoy. And I'm really interested in robotic milking systems. Now,
these machines have been around since the mid-90s, but they're growing in popularity. Is that down to the grants that have become available for them?
Yeah, I think in part, but also farmers looking at their lifestyles and, not wanting to spend hours a day in milking parlours, wanting to spend more time with their families and more flexibility, so that they can leave the farm from time to time.
What are the big advantages of a robotic system?
It's a nicer way for cows. Cows do actually go into the robots of their own free choice. So they can choose when they want to be milked. So they also get fed at the same time. So that's the other motivator for going into the robot. But a nicer, higher welfare way of milking cows really can be.
And these are incredibly high-tech systems, aren't they? As well as making sure that the cows are properly looked after, getting the right amount of feed. They're also monitoring each quadrant within in the milk delivery and the quality of the milk as it passes through the system as well.
Yes, some of them do that. Yes, not all of robots, but yeah, definitely some of them do that.
So some of the biggest issues are to do with the refusals and the low number of visits and how you have to collect some cows but not others. Could you just explain those two particular issues and why they're a hot topic?
In the UK, I think most farmers would be happy with milking visits at around 3 per day and collect cows at less than 5 per day. But before you investigate why you've got poor visits on robots, you need to check whether there's actually time available on the robots. So you need to check whether there's free time, and that would be a free time of less than 12% available. Then you would have to look at other reasons why they weren't using the robots. So actually looking at the settings on the robots and changing the settings.
Because this is all to do with hierarchies, isn't it? Some cows won't want to approach the robot if there's a more dominant cow there. So having that space where a cow can feel comfortable enough to actually go and approach the robot is really key. But that ties into all sorts of other things, doesn't it? About how nervous they are about the system, how well trained they are to use it. I mean, maybe it might be helpful for you to explain how a robotic milking system actually works within the daily routine of a cow and how they would be expected to use it once they are properly trained.
It's really important to look at data for individual animals. Particularly for heifers. So these are animals that are being milked for the first time. Their first time they're going into the milking herd. So yeah, looking at whether they've actually been trained properly. I've actually seen on one farm where they have in their heifer shed, they have a mock-up of a robotic milking machine, and they feed the heifers through that machine. It doesn't milk them, but it's really nice because it gets the cow ready for the robot before she actually calves. But also really important to look at the area around the robots. So, is it well lit? Because cows won't want to go. They'll want to go in the robot at night time as well. So you need a nice sort of attractive area for them. And then even like the floor surface. So if it's a slippery floor, that will mean that cows won't want to walk on it. So they won't want to go near the robots. And then things like we can attract cows into the robots by the addition of a fan. So it's really nice, particularly this summer where it's really hot weather and there's flies around. So that can encourage the cows to go into the robot.
And in terms of the feed, they need motivation to go in there, and obviously the idea that they're going to get some high nutrient feed is part of that. What advice are you involved in giving to farmers about how to formulate that feed, how to make sure it's right for the right cow? Because you mentioned the technology that's involved with these robots. Each cow is individually monitored as to how many times they're being milked, but also what they're being given, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And the dairy cake is really critical to getting the cow into the robot. So we need something really tasty. So palatability is crucial. So we need good levels of molasses and really palatable, tasty ingredients for the cows to go in there. So it's a good idea for farmers to, check the ingredients list on the dairy cake and actually smell it yourself. Does it seem attractive? And at Carls Billington, we really consider physical quality to be vitally important. So you need a really good quality nut, one that's not going to break up and go powdery. Cows really don't like that. So on farm, we always check the feeder calibration. And this is a really good time to have a good look at the feed troughs and clean them out if you need to do. Look at the feeders yourselves, and is there any feed blocking the troughs that is maybe started to go off or anything like that? Cows really won't like that. Also, we've found that you can get sort of build-up of moisture in the feed troughs if you feed properly in glycol, as some farmers do. So we tend to advise that you can use a product with a flavour on to make the cows lick the glycol out of the troughs and lick the trough clean. So that it's not sort of sitting there and going stale.
I mean, it is such a massive change, isn't it, bringing in a robot from the traditional milking system? You mentioned that there's particularly at the start quite a lot of nervousness around. I guess you would like to be on hand to help advise with things like feed and things like training as much as the manufacturers' representatives would be as well, because the farmers got so much on their plate when they're trying to change this system, as well as looking after the herd. They may have even had to create a new design for their milking sheds and a new design for their farms, maybe in terms of the way that the cows are coming off the pasture and into the sheds. Yeah,
it's absolutely critical for us to be involved right at the start if we can. So we need to make sure that the diet's formulated correctly. So the trough ration, that's the amount of food they get outside of the robot, that needs to be worth between 5 and 7 litres below the herd average. And if it's set too high for too many litres, that really affects visits to the robot. So, if cows have got a really nice, tasty food outside of the robot, they're not inclined to go into the robot. That can be a real problem with grazing, where fresh grass is offered. Fresh grass is really tasty to a cow, so they often prefer that to the dairy cake. They can do. So farmers that have got zero grazing, so that's actually bringing grass inside for the cows to eat, it can be sometimes difficult for those farmers to maintain visits on the robot if that's the only forage source.
How stressed can farmers get when you see them implementing a new system and trying to get everything just right so it runs like clockwork? What are the big early stumbling blocks that you've had to sort of talk them around?
Yeah, so I think staffing at startup is really important. So having lots of people on hand to what we call push cows into the robot. So to help cows, get them up and encourage them to go into the robot. You need a lot of people around, a lot of staff to help doing it. And farms where they've got, good numbers of staff on hand, it works pretty smoothly. It's a pretty good startup. But it can be very tiring because obviously you need people there all the time, right through the night. You need to be have staff on hand.
And also, of course, you've got to keep the herd calm. Otherwise, they'll start to develop bad associations with the robot as well. Yeah. So you've got to get that balance. Definitely. Must be really tricky. When a system is successfully up and running, what are the things that you advise your farmers to keep an eye on?
Yeah, so I think one really important thing is sort of rumen stability. So a healthy rumen is absolutely critical for visits to robots. So cows showing signs of what we call SARA, so that's subacute ruminal acidosis, they won't attend the robot well enough. It's like yourself, if you've got stomach ache, you don't really feel like getting up and going and doing things. So cows are exactly the same. So we've got to be really careful about the diet formulation and making sure that we keep the rumen stable. And some robots actually have rumination collars and tags that will detect rumen instability. And each cow has its own unique rumination habits. And so a change in routine rumination is almost always worth looking into. In terms of the formulation, at Carl's Billington, we're really careful at formulating rations to avoid high acid load, and we also check fibre index levels. So we continue to look at the ration of the average cow, but we also look at early lactation cows. So looking at different cows in the herd for rumen stability.
Explain to me what you mean by collect cows and why that is such a talked about topic amongst farmers nowadays.
Yeah, so it's really the cows that are not visiting the robot sufficiently. So
they're called collect cows because they have to be collected.
Yeah,
and
exactly. Yeah, they have to be collected by hand. Yeah, so the farmer has to actually go into the shed, find the cow, and actually take it to the robot to be milked.
So what could be the reasons behind why they aren't wanting to approach the robot themselves?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons. So collect cows. Some farmers would have on their list not just cows that are not attending, every day, for example, but also I call it could do better cows. So cows that are, maybe going twice a day, but if they went 3 or 4 times a day, would give more milk. So it's those cows that are worth looking at as well.
Yeah, because I guess the whole point of having a robot is that it does free up the time for the dairy farmer, and they don't want to be spending that free time finding the cows who are refusing to go to the robot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of visits to robots is one of the key reasons why we get called out onto farms to investigate.
Oh, really? Just because you've got to help the farmer get to grips with why they're not coming through. And that could be feed related, could it?
Yeah, definitely. Or even, obviously, one important area is to look at lameness. So farmers with robotic herds need to be really on top of lameness problems. So obviously, cows that have any slight lameness, even what we call a back arch, so not a true lameness, but just the beginnings of lameness, if you like, they will have poor visits to the robots. And then actually it's kind of a knock-on effect because they will give less milk and then the robot will reduce their dairy cake. So they're kind of giving less milk and then less motivated to go in the robots because they're given less cake. So it's quite important to discover the causes of lameness. So that might be down to the cubicle design, the bed that they're laying on, that needs to be looked into. So there's kind of studies have shown that, even a mild lameness means that they're 2.2 times more likely to be fetch cows. So these are collect cows. And the milk yield could go down, by about 2 litres a day.
Just for those of us who aren't experienced in this area, I'm fascinated by the hierarchy within a herd and how that can affect milk yield when it comes to the robots. I know we touched on this earlier, but just give us an idea of how you can help with that if a farmer is concerned about making sure that every cow gets what they need.
Yeah, I mean, if there's sufficient free time on the robots, it certainly becomes less of an issue. Where, we've got a lot of cows on the robot, then obviously there isn't much time for those submissive animals to be able to sort of sneak in and use the robot without dominant animals standing there. Also sort of the building design, so plenty of space in front of the robots so that submissive animals don't feel trapped. That will really help as well.
So you might be able to advise. I mean, I appreciate that once the machine's in place, it's quite difficult, but making sure that there is plenty of space around it so that every cow gets their turn, I guess, and doesn't feel intimidated away from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
What advice can you give farmers on milking and feeding times? Because the cycle of milking and feeding is obviously different slightly for every single animal.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because there's quite well proven links between feeding activity and then milking visits to the robot. So what farmers need to do is make sure that feed is being pushed up, so it's always in front of the cows. So feed is available, fresh feed is available, nice tasty feed outside is there all the time. Otherwise, what happens is you get sort of bouts of feeding behaviour, and then of course you get bouts of milking behaviour. So when an animal goes and eats a big meal, the next thing it wants to do is go and be milked, which obviously then creates queues at the robots.
What's that like, watching the cows queue up of their own accord to be milked by a robot? I mean, it seems, well, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't believe it could happen, would you?
No, you wouldn't. No, absolutely not. I mean, you're trying to avoid those queues really, because otherwise, if you get, peaks of robot use, you're not utilising the robot as efficiently as you might be. You'd like those visits spread a bit better over 24 hours. And also, of course, the heifers or the submissive animals will probably think, I'm not going to queue there. I'll go and eat some trough instead. And I won't be milked. And so their visits could go down. It's also quite interesting that studies have shown that more stimulation to feed across the day, staggered by the milking spread out better, means you get improved feed efficiency. So for every kilo of feed you put in, you get more milk out. And that's a 7% increase in efficiency.
What would you say are the things that robotic milking hasn't quite cracked yet? What would you like to see improved by the manufacturers in order to help the farmers that you work with?
I think the sort of interesting developments that are coming through are sort of the online sensors. So, being able to actually tell when a cow is pregnant by the milk tests. And hopefully, I would really like to be able to, if we're able to measure sort of metabolites in milk, to tell us, things about the diet. So where she's short of energy, I think that will come before quite soon, really.
But in terms of the efficiency of the milking and the ability to find the teats and the disinfection between feeds, between milking, it seems as if that side of things is being cracked now by the robots.
Yeah, I think so. Sort of looking back to the robots I was involved with in the mid-90s, they were so inaccurate compared with the modern ones. So many failed milkings. But these days, we're looking at sort of less than 5 failed milkings per robot per day. And a lot of farms will investigate every failed milking. So, very few really that fail. And this is a failure often due to an individual animal with a poor teat placement. Sometimes it's worth investigating the fails if they do get too high. Because it might be that you've got something wrong with the robot. So if there's one robot failing and the other robot's working fine, not failing, the robot that's failing could have a feeder blocked or some problem with it, with the lasers or something like that.
Explain to me the difference between a failure and a refusal.
Failed milkings is where the machine wants to milk her, but it can't. It can't attach. That's usually a really good reason for failures. So it can't find the teats for whatever reason. And then the refusals is, cows are set on milking intervals. So they're not allowed to just kind of go in whenever they feel like it and be milked whenever they feel like it. Once they've been milked, there's usually a time before they are allowed to be milked the next time. So if she goes in between that time, it won't milk her. And that's, although she's gone in, it's a refusal.
Is there a way of discouraging an over-keen cow to stop them going into a robot? Or do you give them less good feed? Or what do you have to do to reduce the number of refusals, you're guessing? Or can a robot system live with that? Yeah,
they're quite clever, really, quite clever animals, because they do learn, and they learn that they're not going to get fed again. So they often don't keep going back and back and back. As you might expect. So they do learn that they're not going to get fed again if they go back in.
And what's it like when you're down on a farm which has a robot or several robot systems all working and the farmer's cracked it? It must be a nice feeling, because it does free up that much more time to worry about or concentrate on other things, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And I think it gives the farmer a chance to step back from the business and concentrate on things like animal welfare and health of the cows. So rather than just doing the routine, daily task of milking, they're able to step back and look at can we improve these animals' health? Can we improve the welfare? And work on things like that.
Are there any problems that robotic systems actually increase compared to the older systems? Is there anything that you particularly have to watch because you're now on a robotic system?
I think the only thing you would probably say is potentially somatic cell count. So this is it's kind of like a measure of mastitis, I suppose, in a herd. So if you were somewhere where they weren't getting the visits on the cows, that could potentially be a problem. So that's another reason why we must ensure good visits so that cows are milked. Really, we want them milked at least twice a day. For early lactation cows, we probably aim for 3.5 visits a day, and then lates 2.5. But if you go down to 1 visit a day, that can increase somatic cell count, and there's a chance of mastitis then.
And because all these cows are tracked individually by the robot, often with information that can be sent to a mobile phone on an app, it becomes very quickly apparent if there are cows that aren't having enough visits.
Yes, it does. Yeah, there's usually the farmer would usually in the morning go through the collect cows as one of the priority jobs, really.
Well, that's it. Thanks for listening to the Future Farmer podcast in association with Cars Billington. For more information about some of the issues discussed in this episode, search for the Cars Billington website. Once there, you can email with your inquiry, or if you've a question about feeds, machineries, agricultural and rural supplies, or fuels, there are Cars Billington experts on the other end of the phone. Listen out for future episodes, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we know if we're answering all your questions. I'm Nick Wallis, and until next time, keep safe and keep farming.